The rain was hammering against my apartment windows in downtown Seattle when my phone rang at 2:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock, unable to sleep, thinking about the bar exam results that would come out in 3 days. The caller ID showed Uncle Robert, and my stomach immediately dropped. Uncle Robert never called this late unless something was seriously wrong. "Danny, you need to come home." His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "It's about your father." My father. The man who'd raised me alone after Mom died when I was 12. The man who worked double shifts at the Boeing plant to put me through law school. The man who never missed a single one of my baseball games in high school, even when his back was killing him from standing on the factory floor all day. "What happened?" I managed to ask, already reaching for my jacket. "He's been arrested, Danny. They're saying he stole money from the company." "A lot of money?" The world seemed to tilt. My father, Thomas Mitchell, was the most honest man I knew. He'd return a penny if the cashier gave him too much change. He'd drive across town to return a wallet he found on the street. The idea of him stealing anything, let alone from Boeing where he'd worked faithfully for 23 years, was absurd. "That's impossible, Uncle Robert. Dad would never." "I know, son. I know. But they have evidence. Bank records, security footage. Your cousin Brett was there when they arrested him. Brett saw everything." "Brett." My cousin who was 3 years older than me and had always been the golden child of the family. Brett who worked in Boeing's accounting department, 3 levels above my father in the corporate hierarchy. Brett who drove a BMW while my dad still drove his 15-year-old Ford pickup truck. I caught the first flight to Seattle-Tacoma International at 6 a.m., my mind racing with questions. How could this happen? What kind of evidence could they possibly have? And why did Brett have to witness my father's arrest? The flight felt endless. I kept checking my phone, hoping for updates, but Uncle Robert had gone silent after that initial call. When I finally landed and drove my rental car through the familiar streets of Everett, Washington, everything looked exactly the same but somehow completely different. The Starbucks where Dad and I used to get coffee on Saturday mornings seemed smaller. The park where he taught me to throw a curveball looked empty and sad under the gray October sky. Uncle Robert was waiting for me at the Snohomish County Jail. At 62, he looked like an older version of my father's same square jaw, same calloused hands from years of manual labor, same kind eyes that now held worry and confusion. "Danny, I'm so glad you're here," he said, embracing me tightly. "I've been trying to make sense of this all morning. Have you seen him? How is he?" "He's broken, son. I've never seen your father like this. He keeps saying he doesn't understand how this happened, that someone's made a mistake." We sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs of the jail's waiting area while I filled out the paperwork for a visitation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Other families sat around us, each dealing with their own tragedies, their own moments when their world had turned upside down. When they finally brought Dad out, I almost didn't recognize him. In just 12 hours he seemed to have aged a decade. His usually neat gray hair was disheveled, his work shirt wrinkled and stained. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They held a confusion and hurt that I'd never seen before, not even when Mom died. "Danny," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't do this. You have to believe me." I reached across the table and took his weathered hands in mine. "I know, Dad. I believe you. We're going to figure this out." They showed me bank records, son. Transactions I've never seen before. Money going into accounts I've never opened. The detective, Morrison, he seemed convinced I'm guilty before I even said a word. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Dad took a shaky breath. "Yesterday morning I was in the break room with Brett and some other guys from his department. We were talking about the upcoming company picnic, nothing important. Then around 10, 2 detectives showed up at my workstation. They said I was under arrest for embezzlement of company funds to the tune of $847,000. $847,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. That was more money than my father would make in 15 years. They read me my rights right there in front of everyone. I could see Brett watching from across the floor and I felt so ashamed. Not because I did anything wrong but because everyone was staring, thinking the worst. I studied my father's face, looking for any sign that he might be hiding something, but all I saw was genuine bewilderment and pain. This was the man who'd taught me that integrity was worth more than money, who'd worked overtime for months just to buy me a decent used car for my 16th birthday. "Dad, I need you to think carefully. Has anything unusual happened at work recently? Any new procedures, new people in your department, anything that seemed odd?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Well, about 6 months ago they transferred me to a new section. Brett suggested it, said it would be good experience for me, maybe lead to a promotion. I started working more closely with the finance department, handling some of the contractor payments. A chill ran down my spine. Brett suggested the transfer? Yeah, he put in a good word for me with his supervisor. I was grateful. Brett's always been smart about navigating the corporate side of things. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was already racing. Brett had recommended my father for a position that would give him access to financial systems. Brett, who worked in accounting. Brett, who was present when they arrested my father. The visiting time ended too quickly. As they led Dad away, he turned back to me with desperate eyes. Danny, I need you to find a good lawyer. I know we don't have much money, but don't worry about that, Dad. I'll handle it. Walking out of that jail, Uncle Robert put his hand on my shoulder. What are you thinking, son? I looked back at the imposing concrete building that held my father, an innocent man who'd never hurt anyone in his life. I'm thinking that someone set him up. And I'm going to find out who. That evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom at Dad's house, surrounded by law books and legal pads. The house felt empty without him, too quiet. I'd called every criminal defense attorney in the Seattle area, but their retainer fees were astronomical, money we simply didn't have. As I stared at my law school diploma hanging on the wall, a crazy idea began to form. I'd passed the bar exam, I was sure of it. I could represent my own father. It would be the first case of my career, the most important case of my life. I spent the night researching Washington state embezzlement laws, studying precedent cases, and creating a timeline of events. By morning I had a plan. I would file paperwork to represent Thomas Mitchell, and I would prove his innocence no matter what it took. But first, I needed to have a conversation with my cousin Brett. The Boeing Everett factory was a city unto itself, sprawling across acres of industrial landscape north of Seattle. As I drove through the main gate the next morning showing my visitor's pass to the security guard, I couldn't help but think about all the times Dad had brought me here for take your kid to work day. Back then, the massive buildings had seemed magical, filled with the sounds of progress and American ingenuity. Now they felt ominous. Brett's office was on the third floor of the administrative building, far removed from the factory floor where my father had spent his career. The elevator ride up felt like ascending into a different world, one of carpeted hallways, motivational posters, and the quiet hum of air conditioning. Danny? Brett stood up from behind his mahogany desk as I entered, extending his hand with what seemed like genuine warmth. I'm so sorry about Uncle Thomas. This whole thing is just unbelievable. Brett had always been good-looking in that polished corporate way. Where my father and I were rough around the edges, products of blue-collar upbringing, Brett had managed to smooth himself out. His suit was expensive, his haircut perfect, his smile practiced. I need to ask you some questions about what happened, I said, taking the chair across from his desk. Of course. Anything I can do to help. He sat back down, folding his hands. I still can't believe it. Uncle Thomas has always been the most honest person in our family. You were there when they arrested him. Brett's expression grew somber. It was horrible, Danny. Absolutely horrible. I was in a meeting with some contractors when Detective Morrison came looking for me. He wanted to know about Uncle Thomas's access to the payment systems. What kind of access? Well, when I recommended him for the transfer 6 months ago, he was given authorization to approve contractor payments up to $50,000. It was supposed to streamline the process, reduce bureaucratic delays. I pulled out my legal pad. And you recommended him for this position? I did. Brett's voice carried a hint of regret. I thought it would be good for him, you know? A chance to move beyond the factory floor, maybe work his way up to a supervisor position before retirement. Tell me about the evidence they showed you. Brett leaned forward, his expression troubled. The detectives had bank records showing regular deposits into an account registered under Uncle Thomas's name and social security number. The deposits coincided perfectly with payments he'd approved for a contractor called Pacific Northwest Construction Solutions. I wrote down the company name. What kind of work did they do? Facility maintenance, mostly. They had contracts for electrical work, plumbing repairs, HVAC maintenance. Nothing unusual except Brett paused, seeming to wrestle with something. Except what? Except when Detective Morrison called Pacific Northwest Construction, the number was disconnected. The address on their incorporation papers led to an empty lot in Tacoma. My pen stopped moving. A fake contractor meant fake invoices, fake payments, and a very sophisticated scheme. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment theft by a desperate factory worker. This was an elaborate fraud that required inside knowledge of Boeing's payment systems. Brett, who else knew about Dad's new authorization levels? Well, me, obviously. My supervisor, Janet Rodriguez. The IT department had to set up his access credentials. And anyone in the contractor management division would have known who was approving their payments. I spent the next hour going through the timeline with Brett, making notes about every detail. He was helpful, almost too helpful, volunteering information before I asked for it. But something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. After leaving Brett's office, I drove across town to visit Janet Rodriguez, his supervisor. She was a stern woman in her 50s who'd worked her way up through Boeing's ranks over 2 decades. "Your father seemed like a good man," she said, ushering me into her office. "Quiet, hardworking, always on time. That's why this is so shocking." Brett mentioned that he recommended my father for the transfer. Was that unusual? Janet considered the question. Not unusual exactly, but I was surprised. Brett had never shown much interest in helping factory workers advance before. He tends to focus on, well, people more at his level. What do you mean? Brett's ambitious, Mr. Mitchell. He's been angling for a promotion to senior accounting manager for over a year. He's very focused on his career advancement. As I drove home, Janet's words echoed in my mind. Brett was ambitious. He'd never shown interest in helping factory workers before. Yet he'd specifically recommended my father for a position that gave him access to the exact system that had been defrauded. That evening, I visited Dad again at the jail. He looked slightly better, he'd been able to shower and had gotten a decent night's sleep, but the worry lines around his eyes had deepened. "I've been thinking about what you asked," he said. "About anything unusual at work. There was one thing." "What?" "About a month ago, Brett asked me to stay late one evening to help him with some paperwork. He said there was a problem with one of the contractor payments, and he needed me to reapprove it because the system had glitched." My heart started pounding. "Do you remember which contractor?" "Pacific Northwest Construction, I think." Brett had all the paperwork ready, said it was just a technical issue that needed to be resolved quickly. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did you think that was odd?" "A little, but Brett knows the system better than I do. He said it happens sometimes with the larger payments." Dad's face fell as he realized the implication. "You think Brett no, Danny, that's impossible. He's family." Family. The word hung heavy in the air between us. Brett was family, but he was also the person who'd recommended Dad for the position, who'd had access to all the same systems, who'd been conveniently present when Dad was arrested. Over the next 3 days, I threw myself into investigation mode. I obtained the police reports, bank records, and Boeing's internal audit findings. I hired a private investigator to look into Pacific Northwest Construction Solutions. I interviewed Dad's co-workers, trying to piece together a timeline of events. What I found was disturbing. Pacific Northwest Construction had been incorporated 8 months ago, just 2 months before Dad's transfer. The incorporation papers listed a Seattle address that turned out to be a UPS store mailbox. The phone number had been disconnected the day after Dad's arrest. But the most damning evidence came from Boeing's IT department. When I requested the access logs for the contractor payment system, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While the fraudulent payments had been approved using Dad's login credentials, they'd all been submitted from a computer terminal in the accounting department, not from Dad's workstation on the factory floor. Brett's computer terminal. I sat in my rental car outside Boeing's main gate, staring at the IT access logs, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Either my father had somehow managed to use Brett's computer without Brett knowing, or Brett had used my father's stolen credentials to steal nearly $1 million from his own company. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was building a picture I didn't want to see. Brett had motive, he was ambitious and wanted a promotion. He had means, access to the payment systems and knowledge of how they worked. And he had opportunity. He'd engineered my father's transfer to create the perfect fall guy. But Brett was family. We'd grown up together, shared Christmas dinners, celebrated birthdays. Could someone I'd known my entire life really be capable of destroying my father's life for money? I was about to find out. That night, I called Brett and asked him to meet me for coffee. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in downtown Everett, away from Boeing's campus. I arrived early and chose a table in the corner, setting up a small digital recorder that I'd bought that afternoon. When Brett walked in, he looked tired. The polished corporate exterior was showing cracks, his tie was loose, his hair slightly mussed, dark circles under his eyes. "Danny, you look like hell," he said, sitting down across from me. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I admitted. I've been going through all the evidence, trying to understand how this happened. Brett ordered a coffee and leaned back in his chair. Find anything useful? Actually, yeah. I found something interesting in the IT access logs. I watched Brett's face carefully as I spoke. For just a split second, I saw something flicker across his expression, fear, maybe, or guilt. But it was gone so quickly I almost missed it. Oh? What kind of thing? The fraudulent payments were all submitted from a computer in the accounting department. Not from Dad's workstation. Brett was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee methodically. That is strange. Maybe someone used Uncle Thomas's login from the accounting terminal. Maybe. Or maybe someone used my father's stolen credentials to commit fraud and let him take the fall. Now Brett looked directly at me, and I could see a coldness in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. That's a serious accusation, Danny. Are you suggesting someone in accounting framed Uncle Thomas? I'm suggesting that's exactly what happened. Brett stood up abruptly. I think this conversation is over. You're obviously upset about your father's situation, but you're starting to sound paranoid. Maybe you should focus on finding him a real lawyer instead of playing detective. As he walked toward the door, I called after him. Brett, I know it was you. He stopped, his back still to me, and I could see his shoulders tense. Then he turned around, and when he smiled, it was the same polished smile he'd worn in his office, but now it looked predatory. Prove it, he said quietly. Then he walked out into the rainy Seattle night. I sat alone at the coffee table, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I had 3 days until my father's preliminary hearing. 3 days to gather enough evidence to prove Brett's guilt and Dad's innocence. 3 days to save my father's life. The Seattle rain had turned to sleet by the time I reached my father's house that night. As I sat in my rental car, staring at the modest 2-story home where I'd grown up, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family had been turned upside down. Inside, I spread all my evidence across the dining room table: bank records, IT access logs, incorporation papers for Pacific Northwest Construction, employment records, and timelines I'd constructed over the past week. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but I needed something more concrete, something that would hold up in court. I called the private investigator I'd hired, a former Seattle PD detective named Carl Winters. His gravelly voice came through the phone at nearly midnight. I found something on your cousin, he said without preamble. 3 months ago, Brett took out a second mortgage on his house. $47,000. Bank records show he was behind on his BMW payments, maxed out on credit cards, pretty deep in the hole financially. Financial pressure. It was another piece of the motive puzzle, but still not enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. There's more, Winters continued. I tracked down the person who registered Pacific Northwest Construction. The name on the incorporation papers is fake, but the UPS store has security cameras. I'm having a friend in the Seattle PD pull the footage from 8 months ago. It was a long shot, but if Brett had been careless enough to show his face when setting up the fake company, we might have our smoking gun. The next morning, I drove back to Boeing to interview more of Dad's co-workers. What I found painted a clearer picture of the days leading up to the fraud. Margaret Kowalski, who worked the station next to my father's, remembered Brett coming down to the factory floor more frequently in the weeks before Dad's arrest. It was unusual, she told me during her lunch break. Brett never came down here before. He always acted like the factory floor was beneath him, you know? But suddenly he was very interested in your dad's work, asking questions about the new contractor payment system. What kind of questions? How it worked, what the approval limits were, how to fix problems when payments got stuck in the system. Your dad was so proud that Brett was finally taking an interest in his work. He thought maybe they were finally building a relationship. The manipulation was subtle but calculated. Brett had been gathering information, learning the ins and outs of the system from my father himself, all while positioning Dad to take the fall. I spent the afternoon at the Seattle Public Library, researching everything I could find about embezzlement cases, particularly ones involving family members. What I learned was sobering: financial crimes between relatives were often the hardest to prosecute because juries struggled to believe that someone would betray family for money. But people did it every day. That evening I got the call from Carl Winters that changed everything. We got him, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. The UPS store security footage from 8 months ago shows Brett clear as day, setting up the mailbox for Pacific Northwest Construction. Not only that, but I traced the payments from Boeing to the company's bank account. Guess where that money was transferred? Tell me. To an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered under the name BM Holdings. The BM stands for Brett Mitchell. I nearly dropped the phone. Are you sure? Positive. I have bank records, transfer documents, everything. Your cousin stole that money, Danny. And he was stupid enough to leave a paper trail. We had him. After a week of investigation, we finally had concrete proof of Brett's guilt. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of elation and sadness. Brett wasn't just a criminal, he was family. He'd destroyed my father's life for money, but he'd also destroyed our family in the process. I immediately called the public defender assigned to my father's case and shared our findings. Patricia Hernandez was a sharp woman in her 40s who'd been skeptical when I first approached her with my theory about Brett's involvement. "This is good, Danny. Really good," she said after reviewing the evidence. "But we need to be strategic about how we present this. The prosecution has built their case around your father's guilt. We need to show not just that Brett had means and opportunity, but that he actively framed your dad. What do you need from me?" "I need you to get Brett to confess." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Get Brett to confess. It sounded simple, but I knew it would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. How? "You're going to wire up and confront him with the evidence. If he admits to anything at all, we can use it in court." The next day was Dad's preliminary hearing. As I sat in the courtroom wearing a wire provided by the Seattle PD, my hands were sweating and my heart was racing. Brett sat 3 rows behind me with Uncle Robert and the rest of the family, playing the role of the concerned relative. Judge Patricia Wong reviewed the prosecution's evidence methodically. The case against my father looked overwhelming: bank records, security footage showing him approving payments, his access to the contractor payment system. Without the evidence Carl Winters had uncovered, Dad would have been heading to trial facing 20 years in prison. But during a recess, I walked over to where Brett stood in the hallway, talking quietly with Uncle Robert. "Brett, can I speak with you privately for a minute?" He followed me to a quiet corner of the courthouse, away from the family members and reporters who'd started gathering as word of the case spread. "Listen, I owe you an apology," I said, trying to sound defeated. "I was wrong to accuse you the other night. I was just desperate to find someone else to blame." Brett's expression softened slightly. "I understand, Danny. This has been hard on all of us. The thing is, I've been thinking about Dad's situation and I don't think he can beat this. The evidence is too strong. Maybe it would be better if he just took a plea deal." "That might be wise," Brett agreed. "The prosecution might be willing to negotiate, especially if Uncle Thomas cooperates." I looked around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, I think Dad might have actually done it." Brett's eyes sharpened with interest. "What do you mean?" "I found some financial records at the house. Dad's been struggling more than he let on. Medical bills from Mom's cancer treatment, some debts I didn't know about. Maybe he just got desperate." "That would make sense," Brett said, and there was something in his voice: satisfaction, maybe relief. "The crazy thing is, whoever set up this Pacific Northwest construction scheme was pretty smart about it. If Dad did this, he was a lot cleverer than I gave him credit for." "It was a sophisticated operation," Brett agreed. "Not the kind of thing a factory worker would typically pull off." "Exactly. It would have taken someone with real knowledge of Boeing's systems, someone who understood accounting and finance." I paused, watching his face. "Someone like you, actually." Brett laughed, but it sounded forced. "Well, I'm flattered, but I didn't steal nearly $1 million from my own company." "Of course not. But hypothetically, if someone wanted to pull off something like this, how would they do it?" And then Brett made his first mistake. Instead of walking away or telling me I was crazy, he started talking. "Well, hypothetically," he said, warming to the subject, "you'd need inside knowledge of the payment approval process. You'd have to create a convincing fake company, set up bank accounts, probably offshore accounts to hide the money trail. And you'd need a fall guy, someone with access to the system who wouldn't be smart enough to cover their tracks." My blood ran cold. He was describing exactly what had happened, step by step. "That's pretty detailed for a hypothetical," I said carefully. Brett shrugged. "I work in accounting. I think about these things." "So in this hypothetical scenario, the real thief would just sit back and watch while their fall guy went to prison?" For the first time, Brett looked uncomfortable. "Well, if the fall guy was actually innocent, that would be unfortunate." "Unfortunate," I repeated. "That's one way to put it. Danny, what are you getting at?" I took a deep breath. "I'm getting at the fact that I know you did it, Brett. I know about Pacific Northwest Construction, I know about the offshore accounts, and I know you used Dad's credentials to steal that money." Brett's face went pale, then flushed red. "That's ridiculous. You can't prove." "Actually, I can. Carl Winters has security footage of you setting up the UPS store mailbox." The bank has records of transfers to BM Holdings in the Cayman Islands. The IT logs show all the fraudulent payments came from your computer terminal. Brett stared at me for a long moment and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was bluffing. Even if that were true, he said slowly, who would believe you? I'm a respected member of the accounting department. Your father is a factory worker with access to the exact systems that were defrauded. You're right, I said. It's your word against mine. Except for one thing. What's that? I pulled out my phone and showed him the recording app that had been running throughout our entire conversation. I've been recording everything you just said. Brett's face went white. You can't use that. It's illegal to record someone without their consent in Washington state. Actually, it's not. Washington is a two-party consent state, but there's an exception when one party reasonably believes the other is committing a crime. I smiled grimly. Conspiracy to commit fraud and framing an innocent person definitely qualify. Brett lunged for my phone, but I stepped back quickly. Don't make this worse for yourself. You don't understand, Brett said desperately. I needed that money. I was going to lose everything, my house, my car, my job. I was drowning in debt. So you decided to frame my father instead? It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought maybe he'd get fired, worst case scenario. I never thought they'd press criminal charges. And there it was. The confession I needed. Brett, my father is facing 20 years in prison because of what you did. I know. Brett's voice broke. I know and I'm sorry. But I can't go to prison, Danny. I have a career, a reputation. If this comes out, my life is over. Your life. I stared at him in disbelief. What about my father's life? What about the 23 years he's given to Boeing? What about his reputation? Brett looked around the courthouse hallway, seeming to realize for the first time where we were, that we were surrounded by lawyers and police officers and judges. What do you want from me? I want you to do the right thing. Go to the prosecutor right now and tell them the truth. And if I don't? Then I'll play this recording for Detective Morrison, and you'll be arrested before you leave this building. Brett closed his eyes and for a moment he looked like the cousin I'd grown up with, vulnerable, scared, human. Then he opened them and his expression had hardened into something I didn't recognize. Fine, he said. You win. But as we walked toward the prosecutor's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Brett had stolen nearly $1 million and framed an innocent man. He'd been willing to let my father go to prison to protect himself. People that desperate, that morally compromised, didn't give up easily. I was about to learn just how far Brett was willing to go. The prosecutor's office buzzed with activity as Brett and I were escorted into a small conference room. Detective Morrison sat across from us, his weathered face showing skepticism as I explained what we'd discovered. Beside him, Assistant District Attorney Linda Park reviewed the evidence Carl Winters had compiled: bank records, security footage, transfer documents. This is quite an accusation, Mr. Mitchell, Detective Morrison said, looking between Brett and me. You're alleging that Mr. Brett Mitchell orchestrated an elaborate fraud and framed his own uncle? I'm not alleging it, I replied. I'm proving it. I played the recording of Brett's confession, watching as his words filled the small room. With each sentence, Brett seemed to shrink further into his chair. When it finished, the silence was deafening. Ada Park was the first to speak. Mr. Brett Mitchell, do you understand that what we just heard constitutes an admission of guilt to multiple felonies? Brett's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Klein who'd arrived within minutes of being called, leaned forward. My client is not making any further statements at this time. But the damage was already done. The evidence was overwhelming, and Brett's recorded confession sealed his fate. 2 hours later, I walked out of the prosecutor's office feeling emotionally drained but victorious. The charges against my father would be dropped within the hour. Brett would be arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Uncle Robert was waiting in the courthouse lobby when I emerged. His face was ashen, aged beyond his years. Danny, is it true? Did Brett really? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Uncle Robert had lost his son today, even though Brett was still alive. In some ways that might be worse than death. I'm sorry, Uncle Robert. I know this is hard. He put his weathered hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing, son. Thomas is innocent, and that's what matters. An hour later, I was back at the Snohomish County Jail, but this time I wasn't visiting, I was picking up my father. The same guards who'd processed him a week earlier now handed him back his personal effects and walked him to freedom. Dad looked stunned as he stepped out into the late afternoon Seattle drizzle. Is it really over? It's really over, Dad? We stood there in the parking lot for a moment, neither of us quite believing it was real. Then Dad pulled me into the kind of bear hug he used to give me when I was a kid, and I felt 20 years old again. "I'm proud of you, son," he whispered. "Your mother would be proud too." The preliminary hearing for Brett's case was scheduled for December 15th. As the date approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating it. Part of me wanted to see justice served, but another part, the part that remembered Christmas mornings and family barbecues, just felt heartbroken about how our family had shattered. Carl Winters had continued his investigation and uncovered even more damaging evidence. Brett hadn't just stolen from Boeing, he'd been systematically skimming money from his department's petty cash fund for months, forging expense reports and manipulating overtime records. The total amount of his various thefts exceeded $1.2 million. "Your cousin was running his own little criminal empire," Winters told me over coffee one gray Seattle morning. "The Boeing embezzlement was just his biggest score. He's been stealing in small increments for over 2 years. 2 years. While my father worked double shifts and worried about every bill, Brett had been systematically looting his employer. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn for my law school graduation. Dad insisted on coming with me, despite my protest that seeing Brett in court might be emotionally devastating. "He's still my nephew," Dad said simply, adjusting his tie in the bathroom mirror. "And I need to understand why he chose to destroy our family." The King County Courthouse was unusually crowded that morning. Word had spread through Boeing's vast employee network, and dozens of Dad's former co-workers had come to show their support. I recognized Margaret Kowalski from the factory floor, several supervisors Dad had worked under over the years, and even Janet Rodriguez from the accounting department where Brett had worked. When Brett entered the courtroom, I barely recognized him. Gone was the polished corporate executive in expensive suits. His hair was disheveled, his orange jumpsuit wrinkled, his face gaunt and pale. When he spotted Dad and me in the gallery, something profound flickered across his expression: shame, regret, maybe even relief that this charade was finally ending. "The State of Washington versus Brett Michael Mitchell," the bailiff announced in a booming voice as Judge Patricia Wong took her position behind the imposing wooden bench. Assistant District Attorney Linda Park presented the prosecution's case with methodical precision. She laid out the timeline of Brett's crimes, the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme, and most damaging of all, the deliberate and calculated targeting of my father as the perfect scapegoat. When she played the recording of Brett's confession, his voice clearly admitting to framing an innocent man, audible gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Brett's attorney, Richard Klein, attempted to paint his client as a man driven to desperate measures by overwhelming financial pressure, but the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. The fake construction company, the offshore bank accounts, the systematic theft spanning multiple years, it painted an undeniable picture of calculated greed rather than desperate circumstances. Then came the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading since this nightmare began. "Your Honor," Ada Park announced, her voice carrying the weight of justice, "the state calls Thomas Mitchell to the witness stand." My father stood slowly, straightening the same blue tie he'd worn to my law school graduation ceremony just months earlier. As he walked toward the witness stand with measured steps, I could see the emotional weight of the past month etched in his shoulders, but also an unshakable dignity that Brett's betrayal couldn't destroy. "Mr. Mitchell," Ada Park began gently, "please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant." "Brett is my nephew," Dad replied, his voice steady and clear. "He's my brother Robert's son. I've known him since the day he was born 29 years ago. And prior to these events, did you trust the defendant?" Dad looked directly at Brett for the first time since entering the courtroom. "I did. Completely. He was family. I would have trusted him with my life, my reputation, everything I had." "Did the defendant ever ask you to work late to assist him with paperwork?" "Yes, about a month before my arrest. He told me there was a technical problem with a contractor payment that needed to be quickly resubmitted to avoid delays." "Did you find that request unusual?" Dad paused thoughtfully. "Somewhat, but Brett had always been the smart one in the family when it came to business matters. He had a college education, worked in accounting. I was actually proud that he wanted my help with something important." Those words hung in the courtroom like an indictment of Brett's character. He had weaponized Dad's trust, exploited his pride at being asked to contribute to something beyond his usual factory work. Ada Park continued her questioning, methodically walking Dad through the timeline: his shock at being arrested, the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his co-workers, the terrifying week spent in county jail surrounded by actual criminals. "Mr. Mitchell, how has this experience affected your life?" Dad took a deep breath, gathering himself. I lost far more than just my job and my reputation, though those meant everything to me. I lost my faith in family, my ability to trust the people closest to me. For 23 years I gave my best to Boeing, showed up every day, worked overtime whenever asked. In a single morning, all of that was destroyed because someone I loved decided I was expendable. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Brett looked up from the defense table where he'd been staring at his hands. Tears were streaming down his face, but it was too late for remorse. Mr. Mitchell, do you have anything you'd like to say directly to the defendant? Dad turned to face Brett squarely. I forgive you, Brett. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred would destroy what's left of our family. But forgiveness doesn't eliminate consequences. You need to face what you've done and spend your time in prison figuring out how to make some kind of amends. Brett's defense attorney made the risky decision to put his client on the witness stand, likely a move born of complete desperation rather than sound legal strategy. Brett approached the stand looking utterly broken, his voice barely above a whisper as he confirmed the basic facts. Yes, he had incorporated the fake construction company. Yes, he had stolen the money systematically over months. Yes, he had deliberately used his uncle's stolen credentials to deflect suspicion onto an innocent man. Mr. Mitchell, what drove you to commit these crimes? His attorney asked. I was drowning financially, Brett said, his voice cracking with emotion. I'd made terrible investment decisions, racked up enormous debts on credit cards, taken out loans I couldn't possibly repay. I was about to lose my house, my car, my career, everything I'd worked for since college. And why did you choose to target your uncle specifically? Brett finally looked toward Dad, then quickly averted his gaze. Because I knew he wouldn't be sophisticated enough to figure out what was happening. Uncle Thomas is fundamentally a good, honest man, but he doesn't understand complex financial systems. I thought maybe he'd just get fired and I could transfer the money offshore and disappear my debts. Did you intend for your uncle to face criminal charges? No. Brett's voice rose for the first time, desperation creeping in. I never imagined they'd press criminal charges. When I learned he was facing potential prison time, I wanted to come forward immediately, but I was terrified. Terrified of what? Terrified of going to prison myself. Terrified of disappointing my father, of destroying my career permanently, of losing absolutely everything I'd spent my adult life building. ADA Park's cross-examination was devastating in its precision. Mr. Mitchell, you claim you panicked, but this wasn't a spontaneous crime of passion, was it? You spent months carefully planning this elaborate fraud. Yes, that's correct. You incorporated a fake company with forged documents. You established offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. You studied your uncle's work patterns and systematically manipulated him into staying late to unknowingly assist with your scheme. Does any of that sound like panic to you? Brett remained silent, unable to formulate a response. Furthermore, when your uncle was arrested and your entire extended family was desperately trying to help him hiring attorneys, raising money for his defense, did you speak up then and tell the truth? No. You actually sat in this very courtroom during his preliminary hearing and watched silently as he faced the possibility of 20 years in federal prison for crimes you had committed. Did you find your voice then? No. In fact, you only confessed to these crimes when my office confronted you with overwhelming evidence that proved your guilt beyond any possible doubt. Isn't that correct? Yes. When Brett stepped down from the witness stand, he looked completely defeated. His attorney delivered a brief closing argument about second chances and the possibility of redemption, but everyone in that courtroom knew Brett Mitchell was going to prison for a very long time. Judge Wong called for a brief recess before delivering her sentence. In the hallway outside, Dad and I stood with Uncle Robert, who looked like he'd aged decades since this ordeal began. Thomas, I'm so sorry, Uncle Robert said, tears flowing freely. I thought I raised that boy to have integrity, to understand right from wrong. You did your best, Robert, Dad replied, placing a comforting hand on his brother's shoulder. Sometimes people make choices that are completely beyond our understanding or control. When court reconvened, Judge Wong's voice carried the full weight of judicial authority. Mr. Brett Mitchell, you have entered guilty pleas to multiple felony charges: embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. These are extremely serious crimes that have caused immeasurable damage not only to your employer, but more importantly to your own family. What makes your actions particularly heinous is your deliberate, calculated targeting of your uncle, a man who trusted you implicitly, who took pride when you asked for his assistance, who would have moved heaven and earth to help you if you had simply asked honestly. Instead, you chose to manipulate that trust and weaponize it against him. You were fully prepared to watch an innocent man spend the remainder of his life in prison to protect yourself from the consequences of your own criminal actions. This court sentences you to 18 years in the Washington State Penitentiary, with eligibility for parole consideration after serving 12 years. Additionally, you will pay full restitution of $1.2 million to Boeing Corporation and $47,000 to Thomas Mitchell for damages and suffering. Brett's legs buckled as the sentence was announced. 2 court bailiffs had to physically support him as Judge Wong continued. However, before we conclude these proceedings, I understand the defendant has requested permission to address the court. Brett's attorney helped him stand at the defense table. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Judge Wong had to instruct him twice to speak louder. "Uncle Thomas," Brett said, turning toward the gallery where we sat. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I need you to understand how deeply sorry I am. You were like a second father to me while I was growing up, and I repaid that love and guidance by attempting to destroy your life completely. I will spend every single day for the rest of my life trying to understand how I became someone capable of such betrayal. I know that 18 years in prison isn't nearly enough to atone for what I've done to you, but maybe it's at least a beginning." He paused, wiping tears from his face with shackled hands. "Maybe someday, years from now, you might be able to think of me as the nephew you once loved, rather than the person who betrayed your trust so completely." Then something extraordinary happened that I'll never forget as long as I live. My father, this man who had been falsely accused, arrested, humiliated, and nearly destroyed, stood up slowly and walked directly to the defense table. "Brett," he said quietly, "I already forgive you." And then he embraced his nephew for what would be the last time for many years. There wasn't a single dry eye in that courtroom. As the bailiffs prepared to lead Brett away in his shackles, he turned back toward me one final time. "Danny," he called out, his voice breaking. "Please take care of him." I nodded, too emotionally overwhelmed to trust my voice. 6 months later, I opened my own criminal defense practice in a small office in downtown Seattle. It wasn't much, just me, a second-hand desk, and a phone, but it represented everything I wanted to accomplish with my legal career. On the wall, I hung my law degree next to a photograph of my father's last day at Boeing, surrounded by co-workers who had come to see him off as he began his well-deserved retirement. Dad had accepted Boeing's generous settlement offer and was finally experiencing freedom he hadn't known in over 2 decades. He'd begun volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic financial literacy courses to working families, his way of ensuring that others wouldn't fall victim to the kinds of sophisticated schemes that had nearly destroyed our lives. Brett continued writing letters from prison occasionally. Dad read every single one, though he rarely responded directly. Forgiveness, I had learned through this painful experience, was an ongoing process rather than a single moment of decision. One rainy Thursday afternoon, as I was preparing case materials for my 4th client, a single mother accused of check fraud who reminded me of my own family's struggles, my phone rang with a call that would change my perspective on my chosen profession forever. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Detective Maria Santos with the King County Sheriff's Department. I have a case that I think you should know about. A man named Roberto Vasquez has been arrested for allegedly embezzling funds from his family's construction company. The thing is, the evidence doesn't quite add up the way it should, and his nephew happens to work in the company's accounting department." I smiled grimly as I reached for my yellow legal pad and a pen. Some patterns, it seemed, had an unfortunate tendency to repeat themselves across different families. "Tell me everything," I said, settling back in my chair. Because I had learned that sometimes justice isn't simply about punishing the guilty, it's about protecting innocent people who can't protect themselves, standing up for those who lack the resources or knowledge to fight back, and ensuring that concepts like trust and family loyalty mean something more substantial than convenient cover stories for greed and betrayal. My father had taught me these lessons through his own quiet dignity and strength. And even though it had taken nearly losing him completely for me to truly understand their importance, I was grateful every day for what he'd shown me about integrity. Brett had managed to steal many things from our family: money, peace of mind, a sense of security, years of happiness. But there was one thing he hadn't been able to touch, no matter how hard he'd tried. He hadn't been able to steal our fundamental integrity. And ultimately, that distinction had made all the difference in the world.